The first thing you need to understand about classified military operations is that they're designed to be forgotten. Records get buried, witnesses get reassigned, and the truth becomes something that only exists in the minds of those who were there. But sometimes, just sometimes, a single moment breaks through all that carefully constructed silence. Sometimes it's a child who sees what adults refuse to acknowledge. Sometimes it's a voice from the past that refuses to stay buried. On a Tuesday morning in September, 8-year-old Mika Castellanos pressed her face against the chain-link fence surrounding Halaman Air Force Base, watching the morning flight drills with the kind of intensity that made her grandmother nervous. The old woman had brought her here every Tuesday for months, a ritual that began when Mika's father deployed overseas. It helps her feel connected, her grandmother would tell the MPs who occasionally checked on them. What she didn't tell them was that Mika had started whispering things during the flights, strange things, technical things that no 8-year-old should know. The F-16 Fighting Falcons screamed overhead in perfect formation, their engines carving white contrails against the desert sky. Mika's small fingers gripped the fence as she tracked their movement, her dark eyes following each aircraft with preternatural focus. Then, as the lead fighter banked left into a tactical maneuver, something impossible happened. The child's lips moved, and she spoke in a clear, measured voice that carried across the observation area. Phantom 77, adjust bearing 270, altitude Angels 15, weapons cold, maintain radio silence until RTB. The grandmother's blood turned to ice. The few other civilians watching the drill exchanged confused glances, but Staff Sergeant Torres, who had been monitoring the area, felt his hand instinctively move to his radio, because those weren't just random words. That was a proper tactical communication, delivered in standard military brevity code. More importantly, it was the exact transmission that had just been sent over the encrypted channel to the formation leader. Torres stepped closer, his training warring with disbelief. Children didn't just spontaneously recite classified flight instructions. They couldn't access encrypted military communications. They especially couldn't know call signs that had been retired from service 15 years ago. But as he watched the small girl continue to whisper coordinates and tactical adjustments that perfectly matched the classified radio chatter in his earpiece, Torres realized he was witnessing something that would change everything he thought he knew about the nature of memory, loss, and the bonds that connect us to those we've lost. The morning sun beat down on the New Mexico desert as Captain Elena Vasquez climbed into the cockpit of her F-16C, her pre-flight ritual as precise as a surgeon's preparation. 28 years old, 5'6" in her flight suit, with calloused hands that had guided millions of dollars worth of military aircraft through countless missions, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone but herself. Her call sign, Compass, had been earned 3 years earlier during a search and rescue operation in hostile territory, when she had navigated through a sandstorm using only dead reckoning and instinct to locate a downed pilot. The nickname stuck not just because of her navigation skills, but because of the way she seemed to always know which direction led home. Other pilots in the squadron had started to depend on her for more than just tactical expertise. She had become their emotional true north, the steady voice on the radio who could talk them through equipment failures, navigation errors, and the thousand small fears that could paralyze a pilot when they were alone in the sky. Elena's fingers moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, checking fuel levels, engine parameters, and weapon systems. Her helmet bore the subdued American flag patch and the distinctive red and white checkerboard pattern of the 8th Fighter Squadron. But it was the small photograph tucked into her helmet bag that held the most significance, a picture of her older sister Rosa, taken the day Rosa had received her wings as a Navy pilot 15 years earlier. Rosa had been everything Elena aspired to be, fearless, brilliant, and completely devoted to her country and her fellow pilots. She had also been the first in their family to break the barriers that had kept Latina women out of combat aviation. Rosa's crash during a training exercise had been ruled pilot error, a finding that had haunted Alina through every flight since. Because Alina knew her sister better than anyone, and Rosa Vasquez had never made a mistake that mattered. The radio crackled to life. "Compass, this is Tower. You're cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Weather is clear, winds light and variable. Have a good flight." Alina's response was crisp and professional. "Tower, compass copies. Cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Thank you." But as her F-16 accelerated down the runway, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Something in the quality of the light, the way the desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, reminded her of the morning Rosa had taken her final flight. It was the kind of intuition that pilots learn to trust, even when logic suggested otherwise. The ground fell away beneath her as the fighter climbed into the clear September sky. Alina settled into the familiar rhythm of flight, her hands and feet making constant micro-adjustments to maintain the aircraft's trajectory. Flying was the one place where she felt completely herself, no longer the little sister trying to fill impossible shoes, no longer the pilot who had to work twice as hard to earn half the recognition. Up here, she was simply Compass, and the sky was home. Below, at the observation fence, Mika Castellanos had fallen silent, but her eyes remained fixed on the shrinking contrail of Alina's aircraft, and her lips continued to move in a whispered conversation that only she could hear. The first hint that something was wrong came during the routine navigation exercise. Alina was flying at 25,000 feet, participating in a formation training mission with 3 other F-16s from her squadron. The exercise was simple: maintain radio silence while navigating through a series of waypoints using only instruments and visual references. It was the kind of drill they had performed hundreds of times, designed to sharpen their skills for combat situations where electronic warfare might compromise their communication systems. Alina had just completed the 3rd waypoint when she heard it, a voice on the radio that shouldn't have been there. Not just any voice, but one that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was Rosa's voice, clear and unmistakable, transmitting on the emergency frequency. "Compass, this is Phantom 77. You're drifting off course. Adjust heading to 270 and maintain current altitude." The impossible thing wasn't just that she was hearing her dead sister's voice. It was that Rosa was using a call sign that had been retired from service the day she died. Phantom 77 had been Rosa's designation during her final deployment, and military protocol demanded that call signs of deceased pilots be permanently retired as a mark of respect. No one should have been using that designation. Alina's hands trembled as she keyed her radio. "Phantom 77, this is Compass. Please identify yourself and state your position." Silence. She tried again. Any station, this is Compass. Did anyone else copy the transmission from Phantom 77? The response came from Major Collins, the flight leader. "Compass, this is Lead. We're showing no radio traffic on any frequency. Are you experiencing equipment malfunction?" Alina checked her instruments. Everything appeared normal, but she knew what she had heard, and more importantly, she knew that Rosa's navigational correction had been accurate. She had been drifting slightly off course, a deviation so minor that it wouldn't have been noticed until the next waypoint check. Negative Lead. Equipment checks normal. Must have been interference from ground control. But as Alina corrected her heading to 270, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the universe. The dead weren't supposed to offer flight corrections. Sisters weren't supposed to reach across the void to guide their siblings home. Yet here she was, following navigation instructions from a ghost. The formation continued through the remaining waypoints without incident, but Alina's mind was elsewhere. She found herself scanning the radio frequencies, hopping and dreading to hear Rosa's voice again. When they finally received clearance to return to base, Alina was almost disappointed by the routine nature of the landing approach. It wasn't until she was walking across the flight line, her helmet tucked under her arm, that Staff Sergeant Torres approached her. His expression was serious, the kind of look that preceded either commendation or court-martial. "Captain Vasquez, I need to ask you about something unusual that happened during your flight." Elena's heart rate spiked. "What kind of unusual, Sergeant?" Torres glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Did you happen to monitor any transmissions on the emergency frequency? Specifically, any communications using the call sign Phantom 77? The question hit Elena like a physical blow. Torres had heard it too, which meant either they were both experiencing the same hallucination, or something was happening that couldn't be explained by conventional logic. I thought I might have picked up some interference," Elena said carefully. "Why do you ask?" Torres' expression grew even more serious. "Because according to our monitoring equipment, someone transmitted tactical flight instructions using that call sign during your exercise. And according to our records, Phantom 77 was retired 15 years ago." Elena felt the desert heat despite the evening air. "Sergeant, I think we need to talk." The debriefing room at Halaman Air Force Base had seen its share of strange conversations over the years, but nothing quite like this. Elena sat across from Torres, both of them trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Between them lay a stack of radio transcripts, communication logs, and a photograph that Torres had reluctantly retrieved from the archives. The photograph showed Lieutenant Rosa Vasquez standing beside her FA-18 Hornet, taken 3 weeks before her fatal crash. She was wearing her flight suit with the Phantom 77 patch clearly visible on her chest. Her smile was confident, almost defiant, as if she were challenging the camera to capture something that could never be contained by a single image. "The transmission was recorded at 13:47 hours, Torres explained, his finger tracing the relevant line in the communication log. "Audio analysis confirms it was broadcast on the emergency frequency using standard military communication protocols. The voice pattern matches archived recordings from Lieutenant Vasquez's service record." Elena stared at the transcript, her sister's words reduced to cold, typed text. "Compass, this is Phantom 77. You're drifting off course. Adjust heading to 270 and maintain current altitude." "That's impossible," Elena whispered. "Rosa's been dead for 15 years. "I know," Torres replied, "but that's not the strangest part." He reached into his folder and pulled out another document, a disciplinary report dated 3 days after Rosa's crash. Elena had never seen it before, but as she read the details, her understanding of her sister's death began to crumble. The report documented Rosa's final flight in meticulous detail, including her last recorded transmission. "Control, this is Phantom 77. I'm experiencing instrument failure and possible engine trouble, attempting emergency landing at auxiliary field. If I don't make it, tell my sister that the compass always points home." Elena's hands shook as she read the words. She had never been told about Rosa's final transmission. The official report had simply stated that Rosa had experienced catastrophic mechanical failure and had been unable to communicate with ground control before the crash. "They classified this?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Torres nodded grimly. "The investigation concluded that Lieutenant Vasquez's aircraft experienced a cascade failure that could have been caused by manufacturing defects in several critical components. The decision was made to classify the details to prevent potential lawsuits against defense contractors." Elena felt anger rising in her chest. So they let everyone believe she made a pilot error instead of admitting there might have been a mechanical problem. "It appears that way," Torres confirmed. "But Captain, there's something else, something that might explain what happened during your flight today." He pulled out one final document, a maintenance report from Rosa's final aircraft. Buried in the technical specifications was a detail that made Alina's blood run cold. Your sister's aircraft was equipped with an experimental backup communication system, Tors explained. It was designed to automatically transmit emergency beacons and flight data in the event of catastrophic failure. The system was supposed to be deactivated after the crash, but... But what? Tors met her eyes. The system was never found. The wreckage was scattered across 15 miles of desert, and several components were never recovered, including the backup communication array. Alina stood up abruptly, packing to the window that overlooked the flight line. The implications were staggering. If Rosa's aircraft had been equipped with an experimental communication system, and if that system had never been recovered, then it was theoretically possible that it could still be broadcasting. You're suggesting that my sister's aircraft has been trying to communicate for 15 years. I'm not suggesting anything, Tors replied carefully. I'm simply presenting the facts as they exist in the official record. Alina turned back to face him. What about the little girl? You mentioned a child who repeated classified communications. Tors' expression darkened. That's where this gets really complicated, Captain, because according to her grandmother, Mika Castellanos has been coming to the fence every Tuesday for months, and every Tuesday she whispers flight instructions that perfectly match the classified radio traffic from your squadron's training exercises. The briefing room fell silent as both officers contemplated the implications. A dead pilot's experimental communication system broadcasting from the desert. A child who somehow intercepted classified radio transmissions. And a voice from the past that seemed determined to guide its sister home. Alina looked at Rosa's photograph again, remembering the last conversation they had shared. Rosa had been worried about her upcoming deployment, but not because of the danger. She had been worried about leaving Alina alone to navigate a world that didn't always welcome women in combat aviation. The compass always points home, Alina whispered, repeating Rosa's final transmission. Tors nodded. Captain, I think your sister has been trying to tell you something for 15 years, and I think it's time we found out what. The drive to Mika Castellanos' house took Alina through the familiar landscape of Las Cruces, New Mexico, adobe buildings baked by decades of desert sun, mountains that stretched like sleeping giants against the horizon, and the kind of endless sky that made pilots feel both insignificant and eternal. Alina's hands gripped the steering wheel as she tried to process everything Tors had told her. A little girl who somehow intercepted classified military communications, a sister who had been trying to communicate from beyond the grave, and a cover-up that had allowed the truth about Rosa's death to remain buried for 15 years. The Castellanos' home was a modest, single-story house with a carefully maintained front yard, and a small shrine to the Virgin of Guadalupe visible through the front window. Alina parked her pickup truck and sat for a moment, wondering how she was supposed to approach a conversation that defied every rational explanation she had ever accepted. Mika's grandmother, Carmen Castellanos, answered the door with the kind of wariness that came from dealing with too many official visitors asking too many difficult questions. She was a small woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Mrs. Castellanos, I'm Captain Alina Vasquez from Halaman Air Force Base. I understand that your granddaughter has been watching our training exercises. Carmen's expression softened slightly. Mika loves the airplanes. Her father is deployed, and watching the flights helps her feel connected to him. I'd like to speak with her, if that's possible, about some things she may have seen or heard during the exercises. Carmen studied Alina's face for a long moment before stepping aside. She's in her room, but Captain, I should warn you, Mika has been saying strange things lately, things that frighten me. Alina followed Carmen through a house that smelled of coffee and children's books. The walls were covered with family photographs and religious icons, creating the kind of warm, protective atmosphere that Alina remembered from her own childhood. But there was something else in the air, a tension that seemed to vibrate just below the surface of normal family life. Mika's room was decorated with drawings of airplanes and pilots, sketches that showed remarkable detail for a child's artwork. But it was the notebook on her desk that made Alina pause. The pages were filled with precise technical diagrams, radio frequencies, and what appeared to be military code abbreviations. "Mika," Carmen called softly, "there's someone here to see you." The girl who emerged from behind a fortress of stuffed animals was small for her age, with Rosa's same dark eyes and the kind of serious expression that suggested she had been forced to grow up too quickly. She wore a pink t-shirt with an airplane printed on the front and held a worn notebook against her chest. "Are you a pilot?" Mika asked, her voice carrying the kind of directness that only children possessed. "I am," Alina replied, kneeling to meet the girl at eye level. "I fly F-16s from the base where you watch the exercises." Mika nodded solemnly. "I know your compass," she told me. Alina felt the world tilt slightly. "She told you? Who told you?" "The lady pilot. She talks to me sometimes when I'm watching the airplanes. She says she's your sister." Carmen crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Spanish. Alina felt her throat constrict as she tried to maintain her composure. "What does she look like, this lady pilot?" Mika opened her notebook and showed Alina a drawing that made her heart stop. It was Rosa, unmistakably Rosa, rendered in colored pencils with the kind of loving detail that suggested the artist had studied her subject for hours. She was wearing a flight suit with the Phantom 77 patch clearly visible, and her expression was both protective and sad. "She's pretty," Mika said matter-of-factly, "but she's also sad. She says she's been trying to tell you something important, but you haven't been listening." Alina's hands trembled as she examined the drawing. Every detail was perfect, from Rosa's distinctive smile to the way she wore her hair pulled back in a regulation bun. But how could a child who had never met Rosa know these details? "Mika, what does she want to tell me?" The girl's expression grew serious. "She says the crash wasn't her fault. She says someone needs to find the black box from her airplane because it will show what really happened. And she says to tell you that the compass always points home, but sometimes you have to walk through the desert to find it." Alina closed her eyes, remembering Rosa's final transmission. The same words, delivered by a child who couldn't possibly know their significance. "There's something else," Mika continued. "She says there are other pilots who need help, pilots who crashed because their airplanes were broken, but nobody believed them. She says you're the only one who can help them find peace." Carmen placed a protective hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Captain, I don't understand what's happening to my granddaughter. She's just a little girl." Alina looked at the notebook full of technical diagrams and military communications. "Mrs. Castellanos, I think your granddaughter may be the key to solving a mystery that's been hidden for 15 years. The investigation that followed would eventually involve the FBI, the FAA, and congressional oversight committees. But it began with Alina sitting in a little girl's bedroom, listening to messages from the dead, and trying to understand how the universe had conspired to bring the truth to light. Because sometimes, the most important truths are delivered by the most unlikely messengers. The next morning, Alina arrived at Halaman Air Force Base with a sense of purpose that had been absent from her life for years. She had spent the night reviewing every detail of Rosa's crash, every inconsistency in the official report, and every piece of evidence that had been classified or ignored. The conversation with Mika had awakened something in her, not just grief for her sister, but anger at a system that had prioritized convenience over truth. Her first stop was the office of Colonel James Morrison, the base commander. Morrison was a career officer who had earned his reputation through competence rather than charisma, and Alina respected him for his no-nonsense approach to military leadership. But she also knew that what she was about to propose would challenge everything he believed about the chain of command and the importance of classified information. "Colonel, I need to request access to archived crash investigation files," Alina began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was asking. Morrison looked up from his morning briefing materials. "What kind of archives, Captain?" "Everything related to the crash of Navy Lieutenant Rosa Vasquez 15 years ago. I have reason to believe the investigation was incomplete." Morrison set down his coffee cup and studied Alina's face. "Captain, I'm going to ask you this once. Are you requesting this information in your official capacity as a United States Air Force officer, or are you pursuing a personal vendetta?" Alina had anticipated this question. "Both, sir, but I believe the personal and professional considerations overlap in this case." "Explain." Alina pulled out her copy of the maintenance report that Torres had shown her. Lieutenant Vasquez's aircraft was equipped with experimental communication equipment that was never recovered from the crash site. There's evidence that this equipment may still be broadcasting, and that it may contain flight data that could exonerate my sister and potentially identify safety issues that affected other aircraft. Morrison read the report carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious. "Captain, this document is classified. How did you obtain it?" "Staff Sergeant Torres discovered it during a routine investigation into unusual radio communications. Sir, I believe there may be a pattern of crashes that were attributed to pilot error when they were actually caused by mechanical failures." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "That's a serious allegation, Captain. Do you have evidence to support it?" Alina had spent the night preparing for this moment. She pulled out a folder containing crash reports, maintenance records, and statistical analyses that she had compiled from publicly available sources. Over the past 20 years, there have been 17 crashes involving military aircraft that were attributed to pilot error, despite the pilot's exemplary service records. In each case, the aircraft involved were equipped with components manufactured by the same defense contractors. In each case, key pieces of evidence were either classified or reported as missing. Morrison studied the documents with the kind of attention that Alina had hoped for. As a pilot himself, he understood the implications of what she was suggesting. "Captain, if you're right about this, it would represent a massive failure of oversight by multiple agencies. The political and legal ramifications would be enormous." Alina nodded. "Yes, sir. But it would also mean that 17 pilots died because someone was more interested in protecting corporate profits than in ensuring flight safety." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing the potential consequences of authorizing Alina's investigation. Finally, he reached for his phone. "Colonel Morrison calling Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I need to speak with Agent Sarah Chen about opening a case involving potential contractor fraud and cover-up of safety violations." Alina felt a surge of relief and apprehension. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Either she would vindicate Rosa's memory and prevent future tragedies, or she would destroy her own career in pursuit of a truth that no one wanted to hear. "Captain," Morrison said after ending his call, "you have 72 hours to compile a preliminary report. If DCIS determines there's sufficient evidence to warrant a full investigation, you'll be temporarily assigned to their team. If not—" "I understand, sir." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Alina, I knew your sister. Rosa was one of the finest pilots I've ever served with. If there's even a chance that her death was caused by preventable mechanical failure, then we owe it to her memory to find the truth." Alina felt tears threatening to break through her professional composure. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet," Morrison replied. "What you're proposing will make you a lot of enemies. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Alina thought about Rosa's final transmission, about Mika's drawings, and about the voice on the radio that had guided her home. "I've been ready for 15 years, sir." The task Alina had set for herself was overwhelming. 72 hours to compile evidence of a conspiracy that had potentially caused the deaths of 17 pilots and had been covered up by some of the most powerful defense contractors in the country. But as she sat in her temporary office, surrounded by boxes of files and reports, Alina felt the kind of focus that had made her an exceptional pilot. She began with Rosa's case, mapping out every detail of the crash investigation. The official report stated that Rosa had experienced spatial disorientation during a routine training flight, resulting in controlled flight into terrain. But the maintenance records told a different story. Rosa's aircraft had been flagged for recurring problems with its flight control system, problems that had been reported but never fully investigated. The experimental communication equipment that Tors had mentioned was particularly intriguing. According to the technical specifications, it was designed to automatically transmit flight data and emergency beacons in the event of catastrophic failure. But the system was so new that standard recovery procedures hadn't been developed for it. Alina cross-referenced the crash site coordinates with geological surveys and discovered something that made her blood run cold. The wreckage had been scattered across an area that included several deep arroyos, desert washes that could easily hide debris for decades. If the communication equipment had been thrown into one of these arroyos, it could have remained hidden and potentially functional for years. But it was the pattern of similar crashes that really convinced Alina she was on the right track. Each of the 17 incidents involved aircraft with components manufactured by Meridian Defense Systems, a contractor that had been involved in multiple safety controversies over the years. Each crash had been attributed to pilot error despite the pilot's exemplary service records. And in each case, key pieces of evidence had been classified or reported as missing. The statistical probability that 17 exceptional pilots would all make fatal errors involving aircraft with components from the same manufacturer was vanishingly small. But the probability that a systematic cover-up had been orchestrated to protect corporate interests was unfortunately quite high. Alina's investigation was interrupted by a knock on her door. Staff Sergeant Tors entered, carrying a folder marked with the highest classification levels. "Captain, I think you need to see this. We've been monitoring the radio frequencies around the crash site, and we've detected something unusual." Alina looked up from her computer screen. "What kind of unusual?" Tors opened the folder and pulled out a series of spectral analysis charts. "We've been picking up intermittent transmissions from the desert area where your sister's aircraft crashed. The signals are weak and irregular, but they're definitely artificial, and they're broadcasting on frequencies that match the experimental communication equipment." Alina felt her heart rate spike. "Are you saying Rosa's aircraft is still transmitting?" "I'm saying that something in that desert is broadcasting flight data and emergency beacons on frequencies that were assigned to experimental military communication systems 15 years ago." Alina stared at the charts, trying to process the implications. If Rosa's aircraft was still transmitting, then the flight data recorder might still be functional. And if the flight data recorder was functional, it would contain irrefutable evidence of what had actually caused the crash. "Sergeant, I need you to arrange for a recovery team to search the crash site. Full archaeological protocols. I want every piece of debris cataloged and analyzed." Tors nodded. "Already in motion, Captain. Colonel Morrison authorized the search this morning. The team will be on site at first light tomorrow." Alina looked at the crash site photographs that covered her desk. Somewhere in that vast expanse of desert, Rosa's aircraft was still trying to tell its story. After 15 years of silence, the truth was finally ready to be heard. "There's something else," Tors continued. "The little girl, Mika Castellanos, she's been asking her grandmother to take her to the crash site. She says Rosa wants to show her where the important pieces are hidden." Alina closed her eyes, remembering Mika's drawing of Rosa and the child's matter-of-fact description of conversations with the dead. "Sergeant, I think we need to take that little girl seriously." "Yes, ma'am. I've already contacted Mrs. Castellanos. She's agreed to bring Mika to the site tomorrow, with the understanding that this is an official investigation." Alina nodded, though she wondered how any of this could be considered official when it involved guidance from beyond the grave. But she had learned to trust her instincts as a pilot, and every instinct she possessed told her that Mika Castellanos was the key to solving a mystery that had haunted her family for 15 years. The recovery team assembled at the crash site before dawn, their equipment creating strange silhouettes against the desert landscape. Alina stood at the edge of the search area, watching as forensic specialists prepared ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors. 15 years of wind and rain had erased most visible signs of the crash, but the desert had a way of preserving secrets in its hidden places. Mika Castellanos arrived with her grandmother just as the sun crested the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. The little girl carried her notebook and wore a serious expression that seemed far too adult for her 8 years. "She's been talking about this all week," Carmen Castellanos told Alina. "She says Rosa is excited that someone finally wants to listen to her story." Alina knelt beside Mika, studying the child's face for any sign of deception or confusion. What she saw instead was a kind of certainty that reminded her of Rosa's confidence in the cockpit. "Mika, can you tell me what Rosa wants us to find?" The girl opened her notebook and showed Alina a new drawing. It depicted the crash site from an aerial perspective, with remarkable detail about the terrain and the distribution of debris. But it was the annotations that made Alina's breath catch. Mika had marked specific locations with precise coordinates and technical descriptions that no child should have been able to produce. "She says the black box is in the deep wash, about 200 yards from where they found the biggest piece of the airplane," Mika explained. "She also says there's a piece of the wing that has burn marks that don't match the fire pattern from the crash." Alina showed the drawing to Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the forensic specialist leading the recovery team. Martinez examined the coordinates with growing amazement. "These locations are consistent with debris scatter patterns from high-altitude crashes," Martinez said. "But how could a child know about burn pattern analysis?" Alina looked at Mika, who was studying the desert landscape with the kind of focus that pilots used when navigating in unfamiliar territory. "I don't think she does. I think she's receiving information from someone who had extensive knowledge of aircraft accident investigation." The search began with ground-penetrating radar scans of the areas that Mika had identified. Within an hour, the team had located several large pieces of debris buried beneath years of accumulated sand and vegetation. But it was the discovery in the deep arroyo that validated Alina's faith in the impossible. "Captain, you need to see this," Dr. Martinez called from the bottom of the wash. Alina rappelled down the rocky slope and found herself staring at a piece of aircraft fuselage that had been preserved by the desert's dry climate. The metal was scarred and twisted, but the experimental communication equipment was still attached, its antenna array intact and its housing sealed against the elements. "It's been broadcasting intermittently for 15 years, Martinez explained. "The system was designed to operate on minimal power, scavenging energy from temperature differentials and solar radiation. It's been trying to complete its emergency transmission cycle all this time." Alina felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the implications. Rosa had been trying to communicate with her family for 15 years, sending distress signals that no one had been equipped to receive until now. "Can we access the flight data?" Martinez nodded. "The memory banks appear to be intact. We should be able to recover the complete flight record from the crash sequence." Alina looked up at the rim of the arroyo, where Mika was watching the recovery with the kind of satisfaction that comes from a job well done. The little girl raised her hand in a small wave, and Alina could swear she heard Rosa's voice on the wind. The compass always points home, but sometimes you have to walk through the desert to find it. The truth, Alina realized, had been waiting in the desert all along. It had just taken the right person to show them where to look. The flight data recovery took place in a secure facility at Holloman Air Force Base, with representatives from the FBI, the FAA, and the Defense Criminal Investigative Service in attendance. Alina sat in the observation room, watching as technicians carefully extracted 15 years' worth of data from Rosa's experimental communication system. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation and official scrutiny. Colonel Morrison had made it clear that the results of this analysis would determine whether Alina's investigation would proceed or whether she would face disciplinary action for pursuing unsupported theories. Agent Sarah Chen from DCIS was a compact woman with sharp eyes and the kind of methodical approach that reminded Alina of the best military investigators. She had reviewed Alina's preliminary report with professional skepticism, but the discovery of the intact flight data recorder had clearly shifted her perspective. "Captain Vasquez," Agent Chen said, "I want you to understand that what we're about to see will either validate your sister's reputation or confirm that her death was the result of pilot error. Are you prepared for either outcome?" Alina nodded, though she felt far from prepared. 15 years of believing in Rosa's competence and integrity had led to this moment, and she knew that her entire understanding of her sister's death was about to be either vindicated or shattered. Dr. Martinez activated the data recovery system, and the screens filled with numbers, graphs, and technical readouts that represented the final minutes of Rosa's life. The flight parameters showed normal operation through the first 23 minutes of the training flight, with all systems functioning within acceptable ranges. Then at 23:47 into the flight, something changed. There, Dr. Martinez pointed to a sudden spike in the data streams. The flight control system is registering massive input fluctuations. Alina leaned forward, studying the readouts. The data showed that Rosa's aircraft had begun experiencing erratic control responses, with the flight control computers receiving conflicting signals from multiple sensors. "It's a cascade failure," Dr. Martinez continued. "The primary flight control system is fighting against backup systems that are receiving false data from malfunctioning sensors." Agent Chen made notes on her tablet. "Is this consistent with pilot error?" "No," Dr. Martinez replied firmly. "This is clearly mechanical failure. The pilot is actually fighting against the aircraft's own systems to maintain control." The audio portion of the flight data was even more damning. Rosa's voice, calm and professional despite the crisis, provided a play-by-play of her attempts to diagnose and correct the system failures. "Control, this is Phantom 77. I'm showing conflicting readings on multiple flight control parameters, attempting to isolate the malfunction." Alina closed her eyes, hearing her sister's voice for the first time in 15 years. Rosa sounded exactly as Alina remembered, competent, focused, and completely in control despite facing a crisis that would have paralyzed most pilots. The recording continued. "Control, Phantom 77. I've isolated the problem to the flight control computer interface. The system is receiving false inputs from the attitude sensors. I'm switching to manual control and attempting emergency landing procedures." Dr. Martinez highlighted the relevant data streams on her screen. Lieutenant Vasquez correctly identified the source of the malfunction and took appropriate corrective action. Her flying skills actually kept the aircraft controllable for an additional 4 minutes beyond what should have been possible. Alina felt vindication and grief in equal measure. Rosa had been everything Alina had always believed her to be, an exceptional pilot who had fought against impossible odds to save her aircraft and potentially other lives. But it was Rosa's final transmission that brought Alina to tears. "Control, this is Phantom 77. Aircraft is unrecoverable. I'm going to try to guide it away from the populated areas. If I don't make it, tell my sister that the compass always points home, but sometimes the journey takes longer than expected." The recording ended with the sound of impact, followed by the activation of the experimental communication system that had been broadcasting Rosa's final moments into the desert for 15 years. Agent Chen looked up from her notes. "Dr. Martinez, in your professional opinion, was this crash caused by pilot error?" "Absolutely not," Martinez replied. "Lieutenant Vasquez performed exceptionally under impossible circumstances. This crash was caused by systematic failure of multiple flight control components, all manufactured by the same contractor." Alina felt a mixture of relief and anger. Rosa had been vindicated, but at the cost of 15 years of believing that her sister had made a fatal mistake. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "The experimental communication system was designed to continue broadcasting in the event of a crash, but it was also programmed to analyze flight data and identify potential safety issues. It's been trying to warn us about this component failure for 15 years. Agent Chen made additional notes. "Captain Vasquez, your sister was essentially conducting a posthumous safety investigation. Her aircraft's communication system has been trying to prevent similar crashes by broadcasting warnings about the faulty components." Alina looked at the data streams that represented Rosa's final flight. Her sister hadn't just died. She had spent 15 years trying to save other pilots from the same fate. "Agent Chen, what happens now?" "Now we expand the investigation," Chen replied. "If your sister's crash was caused by systematic component failure, and if similar failures caused other crashes, then we're looking at potential criminal negligence by defense contractors and possibly a cover-up by oversight agencies." Alina nodded, understanding the magnitude of what Rosa's voice from the desert had set in motion. The truth about one crash would eventually expose a pattern of negligence that had cost 17 lives. "There's one more thing," Alina said. "The little girl, Mika Castellanos. She's been receiving information about other crashes, other pilots who she says need help finding peace." Agent Chen looked skeptical. "Captain, I deal in evidence and facts. I'm not sure how to incorporate supernatural claims into a criminal investigation." Alina understood the agent's position, but she also knew what she had witnessed. "Agent Chen, that little girl led us to evidence that had been hidden for 15 years. She provided technical information that no child should have been able to access. I think we need to take her seriously, regardless of how we explain her knowledge." Dr. Martinez cleared her throat. "Actually, there might be a rational explanation for the child's information. The experimental communication system was designed to broadcast on multiple frequencies, including some that overlap with commercial radio bands. It's possible that the child has been unconsciously receiving and processing these transmissions." Alina felt a chill of recognition. "You're saying that Rosa's aircraft has been broadcasting technical data that Mika has been picking up and somehow understanding?" "It's theoretically possible," Martinez replied. "Some individuals, particularly children, have demonstrated unusual sensitivity to electromagnetic transmissions. If the child has been exposed to these broadcasts repeatedly, her brain might have developed the ability to process and interpret the information." Agent Chen looked intrigued. "Are you suggesting that this child might be able to help us locate evidence from other crashes?" Alina thought about Mika's notebook full of technical drawings and crash site locations. "I think she already has been. We just need to start listening to what she's been trying to tell us." The investigation that followed would eventually involve congressional hearings, criminal prosecutions, and a complete overhaul of military aircraft safety protocols. But it began with a dead pilot's love for her sister and a little girl's ability to hear voices that adults had forgotten how to perceive. The expanded investigation moved with the kind of methodical intensity that Alina had come to associate with Agent Chen. Within a week, DCIS had assembled a team of investigators, forensic specialists, and technical experts to examine the 17 crashes that Alina had identified as potentially related to Rosa's death. Alina found herself assigned to the task force as a technical consultant, her pilot's knowledge of aircraft systems making her invaluable in analyzing the crash data. But it was her connection to Mika Castellanos that proved to be the most crucial element of the investigation. The little girl had become something of a celebrity within the tight-knit investigative community, though Alina was careful to shield her from the media attention that had begun to swirl around the case. Mika's ability to provide detailed information about crash sites and technical failures had proven accurate in every instance they had been able to verify. "She's not just guessing," Dr. Martinez explained to the task force during their morning briefing. "The child is providing information that correlates directly with the technical specifications of the experimental communication systems that were installed in several of the crashed aircraft." Alina studied the map that covered one wall of their temporary headquarters. 17 red pins marked the locations of crashes that had been attributed to pilot error, but Mika's drawings had identified specific areas within each crash site where critical evidence might be located. "Agent Chen," Alina said, "I think we need to start treating Mika as a legitimate investigative resource. Her information has been accurate in every case we've verified." Chen nodded reluctantly. "I've arranged for a child psychologist to work with her, someone who specializes in unusual cognitive abilities. If there's a scientific explanation for her knowledge, we need to understand it." The psychologist, Dr. Amanda Foster, was a woman who had spent her career studying exceptional children. She arrived at the Castellanos' home with none of the skepticism that Alina had expected from an academic researcher. "I've reviewed the case files," Dr. Foster told Alina before meeting with Mika. "What this child is demonstrating is consistent with documented cases of acquired savant syndrome, where individuals develop extraordinary abilities following exposure to specific stimuli." Alina followed Dr. Foster into the Castellanos' living room, where Mika was waiting with her notebook and a new set of drawings that she had completed the night before. "Hello, Mika," Dr. Foster said gently. "I'm Dr. Foster. I work with children who have special abilities. I understand that you've been helping the investigators find important information." Mika nodded seriously. "The pilots want people to know what really happened to them. They're not angry, just sad that their families think they made mistakes." Dr. Foster made notes on her tablet. "How do you know what the pilots want?" "They talk to me," Mika replied matter-of-factly. "Not with words exactly, more like pictures and feelings. They show me where their airplanes are broken and where the important pieces are hidden." Alina felt a chill as she realized the implications. If Mika was receiving information from multiple sources, then the experimental communication systems from all 17 crashes might still be broadcasting. "Mika," Alina said, "can you tell me about the other pilots, the ones besides Rosa?" The little girl opened her notebook to a page filled with names and dates. Alina recognized several of them from her investigation, pilots who had been posthumously blamed for crashes that may have been caused by mechanical failure. "There's Captain Williams," Mika said, pointing to one of the names. "He crashed in Alaska 5 years ago. He says his airplane's engine stopped working, but the investigators said he forgot to switch fuel tanks." Alina cross-referenced the name with her files. Captain Robert Williams had indeed died in Alaska, and his crash had been attributed to pilot error despite his 20-year service record and multiple commendations. And Lieutenant Chen, Mika continued. She crashed in California 2 years ago. She says her airplane's computer was giving her wrong information about how high she was flying. Alina felt her heart rate spike. Lieutenant Michelle Chen had been one of the first female pilots in her squadron, and her death had been particularly devastating to the women in military aviation. Mika, Dr. Foster said gently, when did you first start hearing from these pilots? After my daddy deployed, Mika replied. I was scared and sad, and I started watching the airplanes to feel better. That's when Rosa first talked to me. She said she understood what it was like to miss someone who was far away. Alina felt tears threatening as she realized that Rosa had been drawn to comfort a child who was experiencing the same kind of loss that had motivated Rosa's own military service. She's been protecting me, Mika continued, and she's been trying to help the other pilots find peace, but she says it's hard because the grown-ups don't want to listen to difficult truths. Dr. Foster looked at Alina with an expression that mixed professional fascination with human compassion. Captain Vasquez, I've never encountered a case quite like this, but I believe this child is somehow accessing information that exists in electromagnetic transmissions from multiple sources. Alina nodded, understanding the implications. The experimental communication systems were designed to network with each other. If multiple aircraft were equipped with this technology, they might be creating a kind of distributed broadcasting network. A network of dead pilots trying to clear their names, Dr. Foster said quietly. Alina looked at Mika, who was studying her notebook with the kind of concentration that reminded Alina of Rosa preparing for a challenging flight. No, she said, a network of dead pilots trying to save the lives of future pilots. The truth was larger than any of them had imagined. The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez successfully triangulated the broadcast signals that Mika had been receiving. Using sophisticated radio direction-finding equipment, the investigation team had identified 17 separate transmission sources scattered across the continental United States, each broadcasting on frequencies that matched the experimental communication systems. It's unprecedented, Martinez explained to the assembled task force. These systems were designed to operate independently, but they've apparently developed a form of network communication. Each crash site is broadcasting not just its own flight data, but also coordinating with transmissions from other sites. Alina studied the network diagram that Martinez had created. The 17 crash sites formed a complex web of interconnected transmissions, with Rosa's site serving as a kind of central hub that coordinated information from all the others. Why Rosa's site? Agent Chen asked. Alina felt she knew the answer. Because Rosa was trying to protect her sister. The network formed around her need to communicate with family, and then expanded to include other pilots who wanted to protect their fellow aviators. The technical analysis of the network transmissions revealed a pattern of mechanical failures that went back more than 20 years. Each crash had been caused by components manufactured by Meridian Defense Systems, and in each case, the experimental communication equipment had recorded detailed data about the failure sequence. This is evidence of systematic negligence, Agent Chen announced. Meridian Defense Systems has been manufacturing faulty components for 2 decades, and their products have caused the deaths of at least 17 military pilots. Alina felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger. Rosa and 16 other pilots had died because a defense contractor had prioritized profits over safety, and then their reputations had been destroyed to cover up the truth. What about the cover-up? Alina asked. Someone had to know that these crashes were related. Agent Chen pulled out a thick folder of documents. We've subpoenaed internal communications from Meridian Defense Systems and several oversight agencies. What we've found is a pattern of deliberate concealment that goes to the highest levels of both corporate and government leadership. The documents revealed a conspiracy that was breathtaking in its scope and callousness. Meridian Defense Systems had known about the component failures for years, but had calculated that the cost of legal settlements was less than the cost of redesigning their products. Government oversight agencies had been complicit in the cover-up, classifying crash investigation to prevent public disclosure of the safety issues. 17 pilots died to protect corporate profits, Alina said, her voice thick with emotion. And their families lived with the shame of believing their loved ones had made fatal mistakes, Agent Chen added. This isn't just criminal negligence. It's a betrayal of every principle that military service represents. Alina thought about the families of the 17 pilots, all of whom had been told that their loved ones had died because of pilot error. The psychological damage of that lie might never be fully repaired. Agent Chen, what happens to the families? How do we undo 15 years of believing that their pilots were somehow inadequate? That's going to be the hardest part, Chen replied. We can prosecute the criminals and reform the oversight system, but we can't give these families back the years they spent doubting their loved one's competence. Alina looked at the network diagram again, seeing it now as a memorial to 17 pilots who had refused to let their deaths be meaningless. They had spent years broadcasting the truth about their crashes, waiting for someone to listen. Maybe we can't undo the past, Alina said, but we can make sure that these pilots are remembered for what they really were, heroes who died trying to serve their country and who continued to serve even after death. The investigation team fell silent as they contemplated the magnitude of what they had uncovered. It was a story that would reshape public understanding of military aviation safety and corporate responsibility. But for Alina, it was also a story about the power of love to transcend death and the importance of listening to voices that society had tried to silence. The congressional hearings that followed were among the most watched in recent memory, combining elements of corporate malfeasance, government cover-up, and what the media had begun calling the miracle of the desert voices. Alina found herself testifying before the House Armed Services Committee, her sister's flight data displayed on screens throughout the hearing room. Captain Vasquez, committee chairman Representative Davis said, "Can you explain to the committee how your sister's aircraft was able to continue broadcasting for 15 years after her death?" Alina looked at the assembled congressmen and women, many of whom seemed to be struggling with the technical and supernatural elements of the case. The experimental communication system was designed to be extremely robust and self-sustaining. It was intended to continue broadcasting emergency information even after catastrophic aircraft failure. But how do you explain the child's ability to interpret these transmissions? Alina had wrestled with this question for weeks. Representative Davis, I believe that Mika Castellanos represents a phenomenon that we don't fully understand, but her ability to access and interpret technical information from these broadcasts has been consistently accurate and has led to the recovery of crucial evidence. The committee members exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what Alina was suggesting. Captain, Representative Martinez from Texas said, "Are you asking this committee to base its findings on communications from deceased pilots?" Alina felt a flash of anger. Representative Martinez, I'm asking this committee to base its findings on 15 years of flight data that proves 17 pilots died because of systematic negligence by defense contractors and government oversight agencies. The hearing room fell silent as Alina's words hung in the air. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and she was determined to ensure that Rosa's voice would finally be heard. The supernatural elements of this case may be difficult to understand, Alina continued, but the technical evidence is overwhelming. My sister and 16 other pilots died because someone decided that corporate profits were more important than human lives. Representative Davis nodded slowly. Captain Vasquez, what would you like to see come from this investigation? Alina looked at the photographs of the 17 pilots that lined the walls of the hearing room. Rosa's image was prominently displayed, showing her in her Navy flight suit with the Phantom 77 patch clearly visible. I want these pilots to be remembered as heroes, not as failures. I want the families to know that their loved ones died serving their country with honor and distinction. And I want reforms that ensure this kind of tragedy never happens again. The committee's final report, released 6 months later, vindicated every claim that Alina had made. Meridian Defense Systems was found guilty of criminal negligence and conspiracy, resulting in the largest defense contractor fine in history. Government oversight agencies were restructured to prevent future cover-ups, and the 17 pilots were posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for their service and sacrifice. But for Alina, the most important outcome was the restoration of Rosa's reputation, and the knowledge that her sister's love had guided her home through 15 years of darkness. The memorial service for the 17 pilots was held on a clear desert morning, with representatives from every branch of the military in attendance. Alina stood at the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd that included the families of all 17 pilots, government officials, and media representatives from around the world. Today we gather to honor 17 pilots who died serving their country, Alina began, her voice carrying across the silent assembly. For too long, these heroes were remembered for what others claimed were their failures. Today, we remember them for what they truly were, exceptional aviators who died fighting against impossible odds. Alina paused, looking at the front row where Mika Castellanos sat with her grandmother. The little girl was wearing a white dress and holding a small bouquet of desert flowers. These pilots didn't just die in service to their country, Alina continued. They continued to serve even after death, spending years trying to warn us about the dangers that had claimed their lives. They became voices in the desert, calling out to anyone who would listen. Alina's voice broke slightly as she thought about Rosa's final transmission and the 15 years of broadcasts that had followed. My sister Rosa once told me that the compass always points home, but sometimes you have to walk through the desert to find it. Today, these 17 pilots have finally found their way home, not to a place, but to the truth about their service and sacrifice. The ceremony concluded with a flyover by F-16s from Alina's squadron, the Missing Man formation serving as a final tribute to the fallen pilots. As the aircraft disappeared into the desert sky, Alina felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for 15 years. After the ceremony, Alina found herself standing with Mika at the edge of the desert, watching the sun set over the mountains where Rosa's aircraft had crashed. "Do you still hear them?" Alina asked. Mika shook her head. "They're quiet now. Rosa says they can rest because everyone knows the truth." Alina knelt beside the little girl, studying her face for any sign of the supernatural awareness that had made her so crucial to the investigation. "What about you, Mika? Are you okay?" The child smiled, and for the first time since Alina had met her, she looked like a normal 8-year-old. "I'm good. Rosa says I did a good job helping her take care of her sister." Alina felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that Rosa's final mission had been to ensure that Alina would be able to let go of the guilt and grief that had haunted her for 15 years. "She also says to tell you that you're a good pilot just like her, and that you should keep flying because there are still people who need you to guide them home." Alina looked up at the desert sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Somewhere in that vast darkness, Rosa's voice had been calling out for 15 years, waiting for someone to hear her story and understand her sacrifice. "Thank you, Mika," Alina whispered. "Thank you for helping me find my way home." The little girl nodded solemnly, then picked up her notebook and began walking toward her grandmother's car. Alina watched her go, understanding that some mysteries were meant to be accepted rather than explained. As she drove home through the desert night, Alina felt the kind of peace that comes from finally understanding the truth about the past and accepting the responsibility to shape the future. The reforms that followed the congressional hearings transformed military aviation safety in ways that would have been impossible without the sacrifice of 17 pilots and the courage of a little girl who refused to let their voices be silenced. But for Alina, the most important change was personal. She had learned to listen to the voices that others couldn't hear, and in doing so, she had found her way back to the sister she had never really lost. The compass, she realized, had always been pointing home. She had just needed to learn how to read it properly. 2 years after the memorial service, Alina received a promotion to lieutenant colonel and was assigned to lead a new aviation safety initiative that would implement the reforms recommended by the Congressional Committee. It was demanding work that required her to travel across the country, investigating accident sites and working with manufacturers to improve component reliability. But it was also deeply satisfying work, because Alina knew that every safety improvement she implemented honored the memory of Rosa and the 16 other pilots who had died to expose the truth about corporate negligence and government cover-ups. Alina's first major investigation under the new protocols involved an F-35 that had crashed during a training exercise in Nevada. The initial accident report suggested pilot error, but Alina's team found evidence of component failure that followed the same pattern as the original 17 crashes. The flight control system is showing the same cascade failure sequence that we documented in the Meridian Defense Systems cases, Dr. Martinez explained as they reviewed the recovered flight data. Alina studied the technical readouts, feeling a familiar anger at the thought that pilots were still dying because of preventable mechanical failures. Who manufactured the components? Meridian Defense Systems, Martinez replied. They're using a subsidiary company now, but the manufacturing processes are essentially the same. Alina closed her eyes, realizing that Rosa's sacrifice would be meaningless if the same corporate negligence was allowed to continue under different names. We need to expand the investigation, Alina said. I want every aircraft component manufactured by Meridian or its subsidiaries examined for similar failure patterns. The investigation that followed uncovered a new pattern of crashes that had been attributed to pilot error, but which actually resulted from the same systematic negligence that had killed Rosa and the other pilots. The corporate executives who had escaped prosecution in the original case were finally held accountable for their crimes. Alina testified before Congress again, this time as an expert witness rather than a grieving sister seeking justice. Her reputation as an investigator had grown to the point where her recommendations carried significant weight in policy discussions. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, Representative Davis said, what would you say to those who argue that your personal involvement in this issue compromises your objectivity? Alina had anticipated this question. Representative Davis, my personal involvement ensures that I understand the human cost of the failures we're investigating. Every pilot who dies because of preventable mechanical failure is someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's parent. My job is to make sure that we never forget the human faces behind the statistics. The hearing room was silent as Alina's words resonated with the assembled officials and media representatives. These pilots trust us with their lives every time they climb into a cockpit, Alina continued. We owe them aircraft that are designed and manufactured to the highest standards, and we owe them oversight systems that prioritize safety over corporate profits. The committee's final report led to additional reforms that further strengthened aviation safety protocols and corporate accountability measures. Alina's work had helped create a system where the voices of dead pilots could no longer be silenced by powerful interests. But it was a conversation with Mika Castellanos, now 10 years old and thriving in school, that reminded Elena of the deeper significance of her work. "Do you miss talking to Rosa?" Elena asked during one of their periodic visits. Mika considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, but I know she's happy now because you're doing the work she wanted to do. She says you're helping other pilots find their way home safely." Elena smiled, understanding that her sister's mission had always been about more than clearing her own name. Rosa had wanted to ensure that future pilots would be protected from the kind of negligence that had claimed her life. "What about you, Mika? Do you still have your special ability?" The girl shrugged. "I don't need it anymore. The pilots aren't trying to talk to me because they know someone is listening to them now." Elena realized that Mika's supernatural abilities had been temporary, activated by the urgent need to deliver messages that no one else could hear. Now that the truth had been revealed and reforms had been implemented, the little girl could return to a normal childhood. "I'm glad," Elena said. "You did something incredibly important, but you deserve to be a regular kid now." Mika nodded, then looked at Elena with the kind of wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "Rosa says to tell you that you're not just her sister anymore. You're the sister of all the pilots who need someone to watch out for them." Elena felt the weight of that responsibility, but also the honor of being entrusted with such an important mission. She had found her true calling in the desert, guided by her sister's voice and a little girl's courage. The work would never be finished, because there would always be new threats to aviation safety and new attempts to prioritize profits over human lives. But Elena knew that as long as she continued to listen for the voices that others couldn't hear, she would be able to guide future pilots safely home. The compass had indeed pointed home, but home wasn't a place. It was a purpose that honored the memory of those who had died and protected the lives of those who continued to serve. On the 5th anniversary of Rosa's vindication, Elena stood once again at the edge of the desert where her sister's aircraft had crashed. The site had been transformed into a memorial park, with plaques honoring all 17 pilots who had died because of corporate negligence and government cover-ups. Elena was no longer alone in the desert. She had been joined by dozens of family members, fellow pilots, and aviation safety advocates who had gathered to commemorate the anniversary and to renew their commitment to the reforms that had emerged from the tragedy. "5 years ago, we thought we were investigating a single aircraft crash," Elena said, addressing the assembled crowd. "What we discovered was a network of voices that had been calling out from the desert for 15 years, waiting for someone to hear their message." Elena paused, looking at the memorial plaques that bore the names and photographs of the 17 pilots. Rosa's image was prominently displayed, showing her in her Navy flight suit with the confident smile that Elena remembered from childhood. "These pilots didn't just die for their country," Elena continued. "They continued to serve their country even after death, spending years trying to warn us about the dangers that had claimed their lives. They became guardians of aviation safety, voices in the desert that refused to be silenced." Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke about the reforms that had been implemented and the lives that had been saved as a result of the investigation. Today, military aviation is safer because 17 pilots refused to let their deaths be meaningless. Today, corporate executives face real consequences for prioritizing profits over human lives. Today, government oversight agencies are accountable to the people they serve. Elena looked out at the faces in the crowd, seeing the mix of grief and pride that characterized all military families. These people understood the cost of service and the importance of ensuring that sacrifice was never wasted. "But our work isn't finished," Elena said. "As long as there are pilots who risk their lives in service to their country, we must remain vigilant. We must continue to listen for the voices that others might ignore. We must ensure that the truth is never buried beneath corporate interests or government convenience. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for the 17 pilots, followed by a flyover by F-16s from Alina's squadron. As the aircraft disappeared into the desert sky, Alina felt the presence of the pilots who had guided her through the investigation and who continued to inspire her work. After the ceremony, Alina found herself walking through the memorial park with Mika, who was now 12 years old and had developed into a confident young woman with a deep interest in aviation and engineering. "Do you ever think about becoming a pilot?" Alina asked. Mika smiled. "Maybe, but I think I'd rather design aircraft that are safer and more reliable. I want to make sure that what happened to Rosa and the others never happens again." Alina felt a surge of pride in the young woman who had played such a crucial role in exposing the truth about military aviation safety. Mika had used her extraordinary abilities to deliver messages from the dead, and now she was planning to use her intelligence and determination to protect the living. "That's exactly what Rosa would want," Alina said. "She always believed that the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living." As they walked through the memorial park, Alina reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a grieving sister seeking to clear her family's name, and she had become a guardian of aviation safety whose work had saved countless lives. The voices in the desert had fallen silent, but their message continued to resonate through the reforms they had inspired and the lives they had protected. Alina knew that her work was far from over, but she also knew that she would never again have to walk through the desert alone. The compass had pointed home, and home was wherever pilots needed someone to watch out for them and ensure that they could return safely to their families. Rosa's final transmission had promised that the compass always points home, but sometimes you have to walk through the desert to find it. Alina had walked through that desert, guided by her sister's voice and a little girl's courage, and she had found her true home in the service of others. The story of the 17 pilots would be told for generations, a reminder that love transcends death and that the truth will always find a way to be heard, even if it takes 15 years and requires the voice of a child to deliver it. As Alina drove home through the desert night, she felt the presence of her sister and the 16 other pilots who had refused to let their deaths be meaningless. They had become eternal guardians of aviation safety, voices in the desert that would never be silenced as long as there were people willing to listen. The compass always points home, and for Alina Vasquez, home was wherever pilots needed someone to guide them safely through the darkness and back to the people they loved. In the end, the greatest lesson of the Desert Voices was that service to others doesn't end with death. It simply takes on new forms and finds new ways to protect those who continue to serve. Rosa had kept her promise to watch out for her little sister, and in doing so, she had helped Alina find her true calling as a guardian of military aviation safety. The story of 17 pilots and one little girl had become a testament to the power of love, the importance of truth, and the eternal nature of service to others. It was a story that would inspire future generations of pilots and remind them that they never fly alone, that somewhere in the desert, voices are always calling out to guide them safely home. 10 years after Rosa's vindication, Alina stood before the graduating class of the United States Air Force Academy, delivering the commencement address that would mark the culmination of her transformation from grieving sister to national advocate for aviation safety. Today, you join a profession that demands the highest standards of courage, competence, and integrity. Alina began, her voice carrying across the assembled cadets and their families. You also join a brotherhood and sisterhood that transcends the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, between the voices that speak and the voices that listen. Alina paused, looking out at the young faces that represented the future of military aviation. Many of them would face the same challenges that had confronted Rosa and the 16 other pilots whose sacrifice had reshaped aviation safety. 10 years ago, 17 pilots were remembered as failures who had died because of their own mistakes. Today, they are remembered as heroes who continued to serve their country even after death, spending years trying to warn us about the dangers that had claimed their lives. Alina's voice grew stronger as she spoke about the investigation that had vindicated the 17 pilots and the reforms that had emerged from their sacrifice. These pilots taught us that service doesn't end with death. It simply takes on new forms and finds new ways to protect those who continue to serve. They became voices in the desert, calling out to anyone who would listen, waiting for someone to hear their message and understand their sacrifice. Alina looked at the banner that hung above the graduation ceremony, bearing the motto "Integrity First, Service Before Self, Excellence in All We Do." These words had taken on new meaning for her over the past decade. As you begin your careers as military officers, you will face challenges that test your integrity, your commitment to service, and your pursuit of excellence. You will be asked to make decisions that affect not just your own lives, but the lives of those who depend on you. Alina's voice softened as she spoke about the personal cost of military service and the importance of supporting one another through the challenges that lay ahead. You will not face these challenges alone. You are part of a tradition that includes every pilot who has ever trusted their life to the promise that their equipment will function properly, their training will be adequate, and their leaders will make decisions based on truth rather than convenience. Alina paused, thinking about Rosa's final transmission and the 15 years of broadcasts that had followed. Some of you will face moments when the truth is difficult to hear or inconvenient to acknowledge. In those moments, remember that your greatest duty is not to the institutions you serve, but to the people whose lives depend on your integrity and courage. Alina's voice grew more intense as she spoke about the responsibility that came with military leadership. You must be willing to speak truth to power, even when that truth is uncomfortable. You must be willing to question authority when lives are at stake. You must be willing to listen to voices that others might ignore, because sometimes the most important messages come from the most unexpected sources. Alina looked at the graduating cadets, seeing in their faces the same mixture of excitement and determination that she remembered from her own graduation ceremony. The pilots who died to expose the truth about aviation safety taught us that love transcends death and that service to others is the highest calling of military life. They showed us that the compass always points home, but sometimes you have to walk through the desert to find it. Alina's voice broke slightly as she delivered her closing remarks. As you leave this academy and begin your careers as military officers, remember that you carry with you the hopes and dreams of everyone who has ever worn the uniform. You carry the responsibility to protect not just your nation, but the principles of truth, justice, and service that make that nation worth defending. Alina paused, looking once more at the assembled cadets and their families. Fly safely, serve honorably, and never forget that somewhere in the desert, voices are always calling out to guide you home. The compass always points home, and home is wherever people need someone to watch out for them and ensure that they can return safely to the people they love. The graduation ceremony concluded with the traditional hat toss, followed by a flyover by F-16s from Alina's squadron. As the aircraft disappeared into the Colorado sky, Alina felt the presence of Rosa and the 16 other pilots who had inspired her journey from grieving sister to national advocate for aviation safety. After the ceremony, Alina was approached by a young female cadet who reminded her of Rosa in her confidence and determination. "Colonel Vasquez," the cadet said, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for aviation safety. Your work has made it possible for people like me to serve without fear that our deaths will be covered up or our reputations destroyed." Elena smiled, understanding that the true measure of her success was not in the awards she had received or the reforms she had implemented, but in the confidence of young pilots who trusted that the system would protect them. "Lieutenant," Elena replied, "the best way to thank me is to continue.